There's a strange irony in the history of Kiss. The man who pulled them from the brink of total collapse in the early 1980s was the exact same man they quickly pushed out the door. Without Vinnie Vincent, the heavy, revitalized sound of the early 1980s might never have existed. He was the fresh fire they desperately needed, but this fracture didn't happen in a massive dressing room brawl. It happened slowly. A shady contract here, a disagreement there, a guitar solo that went on just a little too long. Some say Vinnie saved Kiss. Others say he nearly destroyed it. Because behind the scenes, a different reality was taking shape. By the early 1980s, Kiss wasn't just a rock band anymore. It was a ruthless corporate machine. And inside that machine, there was only room at the top for two men, Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley. Everyone else was entirely replaceable. Vinnie Vincent was about to learn that saving Kiss came with a hidden price, a price he didn't fully understand when he signed on. And by the time he finally did, it was already too late. The stage lights came up, the crowd roared, and Kiss stepped onto the stage in a way fans had never seen before. No makeup, no Star Child star, no demon face, no Spaceman Silver. For nearly a decade, the iconic makeup had been the visual symbol of the band. But the world of rock music had changed, and on September 18, 1983, Kiss made one of the boldest decisions in its history. They removed the masks. The moment happened live on MTV. Millions of viewers watched Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley reveal their faces to the world for the first time. For younger fans discovering the band through television, it felt like the birth of a new era. But for longtime members of the Kiss Army, it was something even bigger. It was proof that the band was willing to reinvent itself in order to survive. And right in the middle of that reinvention was a guitarist who had arrived only months earlier, Vinnie Vincent. If you had asked most fans at that moment who Vincent was, they might not have known the full story yet, but they certainly heard him. Because his guitar work was everywhere, aggressive, technical, fast. Where Ace Frehley's style had been built around melody and feel, Vincent brought something sharper, a harder edge, a speed that pushed Kiss into a heavier direction that matched the evolving sound of rock in the early 1980s. For Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, that energy was exactly what the band needed. Because the early 80s had not been kind to Kiss. Album sales had slowed. The industry had shifted toward new heavy metal bands. And the collapse of the original lineup had left fans wondering if the magic was gone forever. But when the band released Lick It Up on September 18, 1983, the reaction was immediate. The title track exploded on MTV. Concert attendance began to climb again, and suddenly the band that many people had written off looked alive once more, which meant it was time to take the comeback on the road. The Lick It Up World Tour began on October 11, 1983, in Cascais, Portugal. For Kiss, it was more than just another tour. It was a test. The first time the band would step onto the stage without the armor that had defined them for nearly 10 years. No masks, no characters. Just four musicians standing under the lights. Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, Eric Carr, and Vinnie Vincent. For Vincent, the tour represented something incredibly important. Opportunity. Because this was his chance to prove that he belonged in the band that had defined an entire era of rock. And in the early weeks of the tour, he did exactly that. Night after night, Vincent attacked the guitar with astonishing intensity. His solos were fast, sometimes unbelievably fast. Fans who had grown up watching Ace Frehley's smooth phrasing suddenly heard something completely different. Lightning, fury, speed. And in many ways, the contrast worked. The heavier sound of the band matched the rising popularity of the nu metal movement happening across Europe and America. Suddenly, Kiss didn't sound like a band from the 1970s anymore. They sounded like they belonged in the 1980s. And that was exactly what Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley had been hoping for. But even during those early victories, small cracks were already beginning to appear. Because while Vincent was performing like a full member of the band, he wasn't one. Not on paper, not in the contracts, not in the business structure that controlled Kiss. And that difference, the difference between musician and owner, would soon become the center of the storm. Behind the stage lights and the screaming crowds, there was another conversation happening. Not about music, not about tours, about money, more specifically, about contracts. And here is where the story takes a turn that many fans never realized at the time, because despite performing on stage with the band, despite co-writing songs, despite contributing heavily to the sound of the Lick It Up album, Vinnie Vincent had never signed an official long-term contract with Kiss, at least not the kind Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley expected. From Vincent's perspective, that hesitation made sense. He believed he had already proven his value to the band. He had helped write songs. He had carried the guitar role during a critical transition period. And he felt that his contribution deserved something more than the status of a hired employee. But from the perspective of Simmons and Stanley, the situation looked very different. Because by the early 1980s, the business structure of Kiss had fundamentally changed. In the 1970s, the band had been a partnership, 4 members sharing the brand, 4 members sharing the profits. But after the departures of Peter Criss and Ace Frehley, that model no longer existed. The ownership of the band was now firmly in the hands of 2 people, Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley. And they had no intention of giving that control away again. So when Vincent began pushing for something bigger, potentially a share of profits or a partnership stake, the answer was clear. No. He could play guitar. He could contribute songs. But he would not become a partner in the business. To Simmons and Stanley, the reasoning was simple. They had spent years rebuilding the band after the original lineup began collapsing. They had taken the financial risks. They had kept the machine running. And they were not about to hand over ownership to someone who had joined the group only months earlier. From their perspective, the line was clear. From Vincent's perspective, it felt like a ceiling. And that disagreement began to follow the band from city to city as the tour continued. At first, the tension was subtle, easy to overlook. A conversation here, a disagreement there. But slowly, it began to show up in ways the audience could actually see, especially during Vincent's guitar solos, because Vinnie Vincent loved to play. And when he played live, he didn't hold back. Some nights his solos stretched longer than expected, then longer than planned, then sometimes far longer than the rest of the band wanted. What had started as exciting moments on stage began to turn into something else, a quiet power struggle. While the crowd cheered, the other members of the band sometimes stood waiting for Vincent to finish. And in a band as tightly controlled as Kiss had become, those moments mattered. Because Kiss shows were designed like machines. Every explosion, every cue, every lighting change, everything timed, precision mattered. And when one piece of the machine began operating on its own schedule, it created friction. That friction began to follow the band throughout the European leg of the tour. And eventually, the tension reached a point where Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley made a decision. A decision that shocked many people close to the band. They fired Vinnie Vincent. But the story didn't end there, because the reality of touring created a problem, a very practical one. Kiss had dozens of shows still scheduled. Fans had already bought tickets. Promoters were waiting. And replacing a lead guitarist in the middle of a world tour was far more complicated than it sounded. So after the initial firing, the band made another decision. They brought Vincent back, temporarily. But by that point, the relationship had already changed. trust had begun to disappear. And when trust disappears inside a band that runs like a business, the outcome is usually predictable, because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The guitarist who had helped Kiss restart its momentum was also becoming the next problem they needed to solve. And as the Lick It Up tour moved into early 1984, the tension inside the band was about to reach a breaking point, one that would end with a single concert, one final night, and the quiet exit of a guitarist who had once looked like the future of Kiss. What makes the final chapter of Vinnie Vincent's time in Kiss so compelling is that nothing about it looked dramatic from the outside. If you were standing in the crowd during those shows in early 1984, you wouldn't have seen a band falling apart. You would have seen a comeback, louder crowds, stronger reactions, a band that finally felt like it had momentum again. But sometimes the most important changes inside a band don't happen on stage. They happen in the silence after the show ends, backstage, in conversations that never make it into interviews, in decisions that are made quietly but change everything. And by the time Kiss returned to the United States in early 1984, those quiet decisions were already shaping the end of Vinnie Vincent's story. The American leg of the Lick It Up World Tour began with a sense of cautious optimism. The band had survived Europe. The Unmasked era hadn't scared fans away. In fact, in many cities, it had done the opposite. And then something happened that made the situation even more complicated. On January 27, 1984, Kiss received their first gold record in several years for the Lick It Up album. That moment mattered, not just because of the award itself, but because of what it represented. Proof that the band's gamble had worked. Proof that removing the makeup hadn't destroyed Kiss. Proof that they were still relevant. And sitting right in the middle of that success was Vinnie Vincent. Which is where the situation became almost impossible to manage. Because now, the guitarist who was already in conflict with the band's leadership was also part of the band's comeback. And that made everything more complicated. Because you can replace a struggling member, but replacing someone in the middle of a comeback, that's a very different decision. By early 1984, the tension inside Kiss wasn't just about personality anymore. It had become structural. And this is the part of the story that many fans never fully see. Because what was happening wasn't just a disagreement between musicians. It was a clash between two completely different ideas of what Kiss was supposed to be. From Vinnie Vincent's perspective, he had earned more. He had contributed to songs. He had carried the guitar role during a critical transition. He had helped reshape the band's sound. And in his mind, that meant something. It meant recognition. It meant compensation. It meant a bigger seat at the table. But from the perspective of Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, that table didn't have extra seats anymore. Because by 1984, Kiss was no longer built like it had been in the 1970s. It wasn't a partnership. It was a structure, a hierarchy. And at the top of that hierarchy were two people who had already lived through what happened when control became divided. They had watched the original lineup fall apart. They had watched what happened when different members pulled in different directions. And they had made a decision. Kiss would never operate that way again. So when Vincent pushed for more control, the answer didn't change. No. And once that line was drawn, everything else started to shift around it. On stage, the performances continued. The crowd stayed loud. The band delivered night after night. But behind the scenes, something had changed in the way Vincent was being viewed. He wasn't just a guitarist anymore. He had become a risk, and in a band that was trying to stabilize itself after years of instability. That label mattered, because risk is something you manage or remove. And as the tour moved deeper into the United States, the relationship between Vincent and the rest of the band grew colder. Not explosive, not dramatic, just colder. Less conversation, more distance, fewer attempts to fix what had already begun to break. And that's usually how these situations end, not with one big moment, but with a series of small ones that quietly lead to the same conclusion. By March 1984, the tour was nearing its final stretch. The band had played dozens of shows. They had proven that the unmasked era could work. They had rebuilt momentum. And now they were heading toward the end of the run. But inside the band, there was already an understanding forming. Unspoken, but clear. This version of Kiss wasn't going to last, not with Vinnie Vincent in it, because the core issue had never been resolved, and at that point, it couldn't be. Because the disagreement wasn't about one decision, it was about control, and once a band reaches that point, there are usually only two outcomes: compromise or separation. And by the time Kiss arrived in Indiana in mid-March 1984, that decision had already been made. The final show took place on March 17, 1984, at Roberts Stadium in Evansville, Indiana. On the surface, it looked like any other night on the tour. The band took the stage. The crowd reacted. The music played. If you were in the audience, you probably had no idea what was about to happen next, because nothing about the performance suggested it was the end of anything. And that's what makes this moment so fascinating, because sometimes the most important endings don't announce themselves. They just happen, quietly, without warning. And that night, when the show ended, so did Vinnie Vincent's time in Kiss. No big speech, no dramatic goodbye, just the end. After the Evansville show, Vincent was no longer part of the band, and unlike the temporary removal earlier in the tour, this time there was no return, no second chance, no attempt to fix the relationship. Because by that point, the decision wasn't about performance anymore, it was about structure. And in that structure, Vincent no longer fit. In the months that followed, Vincent moved on. Later in 1984, he began building his own project, a band that would eventually become known as Vinnie Vincent Invasion. For him, it was a fresh start, a chance to create something on his own terms, a chance to have the control he'd been looking for inside Kiss. But at the same time, Kiss moved forward without him. Again, another guitarist gone, another chapter closed, and another reminder of something that was becoming clearer with every passing year. The band could change, the members could change, the sound could change, but the center did not move. Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, still there, still in control. And that's the part of the story that really matters, because Vinnie Vincent didn't just leave Kiss. He revealed something about it, something that had been forming quietly since the early 1980s. Kiss had evolved into something different. Not just a band, but a system where musicians could come in, play their role, and then be replaced when the situation required it. And once that system was in place, it didn't stop with Vinnie Vincent, because after he was gone, the revolving door didn't slow down. It kept spinning. And the next chapter would introduce another guitarist, another short-lived era, another test of the structure that Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley had built. And if you think the story ends here, it doesn't. Because what happened next would prove something even more important about the future of Kiss. So if you want to understand how the band continued to evolve after Vincent's departure, and how the next lineup changes pushed the group even further into that new structure, you need to see what comes next. Part 3, the next chapter of the Kiss revolving door.